Colt Maverick, a truly towering figure at 7 feet tall with a powerful, muscular build, found himself staring in disbelief at the 6 women on the porch. Each one held an identical photograph of his own face, yet he had never seen any of them before. They looked at him as if they had been expecting him for years. The tallest of the women, Eleanor, her face stern but kind, stepped forward with a welcoming smile. The younger women whispered excitedly among themselves, pointing back and forth between Colt and the pictures in their hands. This whole situation made no sense to Colt. He had inherited this ranch, which he now knew as Thunderhead Ranch, from his grandfather, Jedediah, whom he barely remembered. The lawyer had told him the place had been empty for decades. Eleanor broke the silence, her voice holding the weight of a long wait. "You're late, Colt. We thought you might not come at all." The other women nodded in agreement, their eyes fixed on him. Another woman, Beatrice, with fiery red hair and sharp green eyes, held up her photo, comparing it closely to his face. The likeness was incredibly accurate. Colt slowly got off his horse, his mind racing to understand. The ranch house looked well kept, not abandoned. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and clean laundry hung outside. These women had clearly been living here, taking care of his property, and waiting for him with photos they shouldn't have. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake," Colt began. "I just inherited this place. I don't know how you have those pictures, but I've never been here before." Eleanor's smile softened to pity. "Oh, child, there's no mistake. Your grandfather, Jedediah, told us you would say exactly that." She gestured to the others, who moved closer, still clutching their photographs. "He said you wouldn't remember, wouldn't understand at first, but you will." A younger woman with dark hair and rough hands spoke up. "He promised us you would come when the time was right. He promised you would finish what he couldn't." Her voice held a desperate edge, making Colt step back towards his horse. The photographs troubled him the most. They weren't old or faded. They were clear, recent pictures of him as he looked now. Someone had given these women current photos of him, someone who knew he was coming, someone who had planned all of this. Beatrice spoke, her voice sharp with suspicion. "You look exactly like the picture, but you could still be lying. How do we know you're really him?" She held up her photo again, studying his face as if it were a puzzle. Anyone could claim to inherit a ranch. Anyone could ride up here with a story. Colt felt the heavy weight of their stares and the expectations he couldn't grasp. 6 women, 6 identical photos, 6 pairs of eyes that seemed to know secrets about his life that he didn't. The lawyer had said nothing about caretakers. He had said the ranch was empty, but looking at the well-maintained property and these women who clearly belonged here, Colt realized the lawyer's information was either incomplete or false. These women knew something important about his grandfather, his family, and him, something worth waiting for, worth keeping photos for, and worth maintaining a ranch for years without any legal claim. Eleanor moved closer, her eyes studying his face like a familiar book. "Your grandfather said you would be confused. He said you would need time to understand what you've inherited." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "But time is something we don't have much of anymore." Beatrice crossed her arms, fixing Colt with a stare that could cut through steel. "If you're really him, then you'll know about the letters. Your grandfather said you would bring the letters." Her voice was a test. The others watched his reaction, their hands still clutching their photos. Colt's stomach dropped. "What letters?" "Nobody told me anything about letters." He pulled out the legal documents from his saddlebags. "I only have the deed and some estate papers." Beatrice shook her head, but Eleanor raised a hand to stop her. "Beatrice, give him time." "He's just arrived." Eleanor's voice carried an authority the others respected. She turned back to Colt, with eyes full of years of patience. "Your grandfather said you might not have them immediately. He said sometimes lawyers keep important things longer than they should." Her words suggested she knew more about legal matters than a ranchwoman should. Colt looked at the women more closely. Their clothes were simple but well made, their hands calloused from hard work, but their way of speaking suggested an education he didn't expect on a remote ranch. The youngest, Dawn, who looked barely 20, nervously stepped forward. "Eleanor, maybe we should show him the room first, help him understand what his grandfather intended." Beatrice's face hardened. "Dawn, we agreed to wait until we were certain. What if this is a trick? What if someone sent him here to take what we've been protecting?" Her suspicion came from a deep fear of losing something valuable. Eleanor, their clear leader, thought for a moment. "Eleanor," she said, then looked at Colt. "Your grandfather called me Eleanor. He said when you came I should tell you about the night he made his promise, the night he said his grandson would honor what he couldn't finish himself." A chill, unrelated to the evening air, ran down Colt's spine. What kind of promise? What was my grandfather involved in that required promises to 6 women? The questions spilled out, showing how lost he felt. Dawn glanced nervously at Eleanor before speaking. "He promised us protection. He promised us a future when our husbands couldn't provide one anymore. He said his grandson would understand the responsibility that came with this land." Her voice trembled slightly, a mix of hope and fear. Beatrice stepped closer, her photograph crinkling in her tight grip. "And he promised we would never have to leave, never have to face the world alone again. But promises from dead men don't mean much unless the living honor them." Her words carried the weight of past disappointments. Colt looked at the 6 faces watching him, each carrying the burden of expectations he hadn't agreed to. The ranch suddenly felt less like an inheritance and more like a trap, full of duties he didn't understand. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows, Colt realized that simply riding away might not be an option. These women had been waiting for him specifically, with photos that shouldn't exist and knowledge about his family that he didn't possess. Whatever his grandfather had started here was far from over. Eleanor seemed to read his thoughts. "Come inside, Colt. There are things you need to see before you decide about staying or leaving." Her invitation sounded more like a gentle command, suggesting his choice might not be entirely his own. The inside of the ranch house hit Colt with a shock. Every surface was covered with photographs of him at different ages, from childhood to now. But this was impossible. These pictures showed him in places he had never been, wearing clothes he had never owned, standing next to people he had never met. His hands shook as he picked up a photo from the mantelpiece, himself as a boy of about 10, standing beside his grandfather outside this very house. "I've never been here before," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. The photograph clearly showed otherwise. Eleanor watched him, her expression a mix of sympathy and relief. "Your grandfather brought you here many times when you were young," she said softly. "He said the fever took those memories from you when you were 12. Said it was probably for the best given what happened that last summer." The other women had followed them in and now stood in a semicircle, their faces reflecting a shared knowledge of events he couldn't recall. Beatrice moved to a wooden chest in the corner and opened it. Inside were more photographs, documents, and what looked like a boy's clothing. "This was yours," she said, holding up a small, disturbingly familiar hat. "You lost it the day your grandfather sent you away for good." Colt felt the room spin. The fever she mentioned was real. He remembered being very sick as a child, weeks of confusion. His parents had said he lost some memories from that time, but they never mentioned visits to a grandfather's ranch or these 6 women who seemed to know him better than he knew himself. Dawn approached slowly, carrying a leather journal tied with string. "He wrote everything down about you, about us, about what he promised. He said, someday you would need to understand when you were old enough to handle the responsibility." She held the journal out to him, but Beatrice quickly took it. "Not yet," Beatrice said firmly. "Anyone can look confused and pretend not to remember. We need more proof than childhood photographs and a familiar face." Her suspicion ran deep, rooted in a past that taught her not to trust easily. Eleanor sighed and went to the fireplace, pulling a small wooden box from behind the logs. "Your grandfather said if you ever came back and didn't remember, we should show you this." She opened the box to reveal a child's drawing, crude, but clearly showing the ranch house and 6 stick figures in front of it. At the bottom, in unsteady child's handwriting, were the words, "My friends at Grandpa's house." The drawing hit Colt harder than the photographs. He could almost remember making it, almost feel the pencil in his small hand. But the memory remained frustratingly just out of reach. "The last time you were here," Eleanor continued, "you promised us you would come back when you grew up. You said you would take care of us like your grandfather did." Her voice carried the weight of a promise made by a child, but expected to be honored by a man. Colt carefully set the drawing down, his mind reeling. These women had been waiting for him to fulfill a childhood promise he couldn't remember. But more troubling was why 6 grown women would base their entire lives on a child's promise. "What happened to your husbands?" he blurted out, the question escaping before he could think. The room fell silent, and the women's faces grew darker, more guarded. Beatrice's jaw tightened. "That's not a story for your first night back," she said, but her tone suggested it would have to be told eventually. The sound of approaching horses suddenly cut through the evening silence. All 6 women tensed, their faces losing color as they moved away from the windows. Eleanor grabbed Colt's arm with surprising strength, her nails digging in. "They're early," she whispered, her fear clear. Beatrice was already heading for a rifle above the fireplace, her movements quick and practiced. "How many?" she asked tersely. Dawn cautiously peered through a gap in the curtains. 3 riders, she reported, her voice barely audible. "Same ones as last month." The other women moved with practiced efficiency, extinguishing lamps and securing doors like people who had done this many times. Colt felt utterly lost as the house transformed from a place of mysterious welcome to a fortress under siege. "Who are they? What do they want?" he asked, suspecting the answer was linked to the women's husbands. "Land speculators," Eleanor said through gritted teeth. "They've been coming around for months, making offers that aren't really offers at all. They want this ranch, and they've made it clear that 6 women living alone shouldn't expect to keep it much longer." Beatrice checked the rifle's ammunition, her hands steady despite the danger. "Your grandfather kept them at bay while he was alive. They respected his reputation, feared what he might do if they pressed too hard. But with him gone—" She didn't need to finish. 6 women alone on a remote ranch were vulnerable in ways a respected rancher was not. The hoof beats grew louder, and Colt could now hear voices from the darkness. "Ladies, we know you're in there," a rough voice called out, confident. "We've got some papers you need to see, some business to discuss." Dawn moved away from the window, her face pale. "They've never come this late before. Something's changed." Her words implied a deeper threat. "What kind of papers?" Colt asked, but Eleanor was already moving to the back of the house, gesturing for the others to follow. "The kind that don't matter much if you can't enforce them," Beatrice said grimly. "The kind that say this land belongs to people who have never worked it, never lived on it, never cared about anything here except what they can take from it." Another voice from outside, equally threatening, called out with mock politeness. "We know you've been expecting someone, ladies. Heard tell someone inherited this place. Why don't you introduce us to your new friend?" The women exchanged silent glances. Somehow, the men outside knew about Colt's arrival, about the inheritance. Colt felt the weight of responsibility settle on him. These women had been waiting for him, not just because of childhood promises, but because they needed protection from men who would take their home by force. His grandfather's promises were about survival. "Your grandfather told us you would know what to do," Eleanor whispered, her eyes full of hope and desperation. "He said you would be strong enough to stand up to them, smart enough to find a way to protect what he couldn't protect anymore." But Colt had never stood up to anyone in his life, never faced violence, never been responsible for protecting anyone but himself. The men outside were skilled at intimidation. He was a man who had inherited problems he didn't understand. The voices grew louder, and someone began testing the front door. Beatrice raised the rifle, her finger on the trigger. They've never tried to force their way in before, she said quietly. Your being here has changed something, made them desperate or bold or both. Colt realized with growing fear that his arrival had not solved the women's problems, but accelerated them towards a dangerous confrontation. The banging on the front door became more forceful, accompanied by the jingle of spurs as the men circled the house, testing windows. Colt moved to a window and peered through a gap in the curtains, getting his first clear look at the three riders. They were exactly what he expected. Tough men with guns low on their hips and the kind of confidence that came from always getting their way. We can do this easy or hard, ladies, the leader called out, his voice a casual threat. But we're not riding away empty-handed tonight. Time's up on being neighborly about this. Beatrice kept the rifle aimed at the door, but Colt could see her hands tremble. 6 women with 1 rifle against 3 armed men, she whispered. Those aren't odds that work in our favor, even if I'm a good shot. Dawn moved to Colt's side, her voice urgent and low. Your grandfather had agreements with these men, understandings that kept them away. But those agreements died with him. They've been circling ever since, waiting for the right moment. What kind of agreements? Colt asked. But the sound of breaking glass from the back of the house cut him off. One of the men had found a loose window latch, and the sound of boots hitting the floor inside sent the women into action. Eleanor grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, while the others found whatever weapons they could. But Colt knew this would end badly unless someone changed the situation. Stay here, he told them, moving towards the front door before anyone could stop him. Beatrice tried to grab his arm, but he was already lifting the heavy wooden bar. Don't be a fool, she hissed. They'll kill you just for being here. But Colt, the giant rancher, had made a decision that surprised even himself. These women had been waiting for him, believing he would protect them, trusting in promises made by a grandfather he barely remembered. He might not remember his childhood visits, but he couldn't stand by and watch these men terrorize people who had looked after his family's property. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, facing the 2 men who remained outside while their companion was inside. The leader was a large man with graying hair and scars. His hand rested casually on his gun, his eyes calculating as he took in Colt's impressive size. Well, well, the man said with a smile that held no warmth. The heir apparent finally shows up. We were starting to think you might be smart enough to stay away. His tone suggested Colt had made a mistake. This is my property, Colt said, trying to sound confident. You're trespassing. The second man, younger but just as dangerous, laughed harshly. Your property? Boy, you don't know the first thing about what you've inherited or what it's going to cost you to keep it. His words hinted at more than just a land dispute. From inside, furniture crashed, and the third man's voice called out, Nothing in the back room, boss, but I found something interesting in that chest they keep locked. The leader's smile widened, and Colt's stomach dropped. Whatever was in that chest, the women had desperately tried to hide it. Now we're getting somewhere, the leader said, his hand moving closer to his gun. Why don't you step aside, son, and let us have a proper conversation with the ladies about what they've been keeping from us. The third man emerged from the house carrying a leather satchel triumphantly. Found it hidden under some old quilts, he announced, just like we thought it would be. The satchel looked official, like something from a bank or a lawyer's office. The women's faces turned pale, telling Colt its contents were important. Give that back, Beatrice said, stepping onto the porch with her rifle. That doesn't belong to you. But her voice was desperate, knowing it was too late. The leader opened the satchel and pulled out papers, his grin widening as he scanned them. Deeds, transfer documents, contracts signed, but never filed. He looked directly at Colt, satisfied. Your grandfather was a clever man, son. Too clever for his own good, as it turns out. Colt felt the puzzle pieces click together in a way he didn't like. What are you talking about? What kind of contracts? The kind that transfer ownership of this ranch to 6 women who had no legal right to inherit anything, the leader said, waving the papers. The kind that were never properly witnessed or recorded because your grandfather knew they wouldn't hold up to legal scrutiny. Dawn stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. Those documents are legitimate. He gave us this land in exchange for services rendered, for taking care of him in his final years. But even as she spoke, Colt saw the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear that their legal protections weren't as strong as they believed. The younger man laughed harshly. Services rendered? Is that what you call it? 6 women living on a ranch with one old man. No questions asked about what those services might have been. His implication was clear and insulting, meant to shame the women. Beatrice raised her rifle slightly, her finger moving to the trigger. Watch your mouth, she said coldly. There are lines you don't want to cross. But the leader seemed unconcerned. 1 rifle against 3 guns, and you're standing on a porch with nowhere to run. I'd suggest you think carefully about whether you want to start something you can't finish. He folded the papers and tucked them into his coat. Besides, we're not here to hurt anyone. We're here to make you an offer. What kind of offer? Colt asked, expecting the worst. The kind where everyone walks away with something, the leader said. We take the ranch, file the proper ownership papers, and these ladies get enough money to start new lives somewhere else, somewhere they won't have to worry about the past catching up with them. The mention of the past made several women exchange nervous glances, and Colt realized there were still hidden secrets. Whatever had brought these 6 women to his grandfather's ranch, whatever happened to their husbands, these men knew about it and were using it as leverage. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice dignified despite her age and hardships. And if we refuse your generous offer? The leader's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. Then we file these papers with the territorial court along with some other documents that raise interesting questions about what happened to 6 husbands who all disappeared around the same time. His words were like physical blows, and Colt saw the color drain from every woman's face. You have 3 days to think it over, the leader continued, mounting his horse with casual confidence. 3 days to decide whether you want to take our money and disappear quietly, or whether you want to explain to a judge and jury how 6 married women all became widows in the same month. As the 3 men rode away into the darkness, Colt turned to face the 6 women, their faces showing guilt, fear, and secrets finally coming to the surface. The silence after the men left was heavier than any words. Colt stood on the porch, watching dust settle in the moonlight, while behind him the women wrestled with the secrets that had been exposed. When he turned, they all looked at him with shame, defiance, and desperate hope. 6 husbands, he said quietly, all disappeared in the same month. That's not a coincidence. His words weren't an accusation, but they demanded an explanation. Eleanor sat heavily in a wooden chair, suddenly looking every one of her years. Your grandfather saved us, she said simply. All of us, from men who should have protected us, but chose to hurt us instead. Her voice carried the weight of buried memories. Beatrice set the rifle aside and faced Colt directly, her chin raised in defiance. My husband broke my arm twice and my ribs once, said it was his right as a husband to discipline his wife however he saw fit. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing faded scars from systematic abuse. The day he threatened to start on my sister's children was the day I decided I'd had enough. Dawn nodded, her young face hardening with painful memories. Mine sold me to other men when he needed drinking money. Said a wife was property to be used however brought the most profit. Her voice remained steady, but her hands shook slightly. One by one, the other women shared their stories. Husbands who beat them, who sold their children's food for gambling, who brought violence and degradation into their homes. 6 women who had reached a point where death seemed better than another day of abuse. Your grandfather offered us a choice, Eleanor continued. He said there was a way to be free, but it would require courage and the willingness to leave our old lives completely behind. He said if they were brave enough, he would give them a home where no man could ever hurt them again. Colt's understanding of the situation shifted again. What kind of choice? Beatrice met his eyes without flinching. The choice to disappear, to let the world think we were dead along with our husbands, so we could start over where no one would look for us. Her words carried no regret, only the practical acknowledgement of what survival required. "The mine accident," Dawn said softly. "It wasn't really an accident. Your grandfather knew the mine was unstable, knew it would collapse eventually. He just made sure it collapsed at the right time, with the right people inside." Colt felt the ground shift beneath him as he understood the full meaning of what he was hearing. His grandfather had not just given these women shelter. He had helped them murder their abusive husbands and disappear, staging their deaths to look like a mining disaster that wouldn't be questioned too closely. "And now, those men want the ranch because they know the truth," he said, the pieces finally falling into place. "They know what happened, and they're using it to force you off the land." Eleanor nodded sadly. "Your grandfather kept them quiet while he was alive. They respected his reputation, feared what he might do if they tried to expose us, but with him gone, they see an opportunity to profit from our secret." Beatrice stepped closer to Colt, her expression intense. "So now you know what you've inherited. Not just a ranch, but the responsibility for protecting 6 women who killed their husbands to save their own lives. The question is whether you're man enough to honor that responsibility or whether you'll take the easy path and let them destroy us." The weight of the decision pressed down on Colt. He could walk away, let the women face the consequences, and avoid becoming involved in events that happened before he even knew this place existed. Or he could stand with them, knowing it would make him an accessory to murder and a target for dangerous men. But as he looked at their faces, weathered by hardship but not broken, he realized the choice had been made the moment he decided to honor a childhood promise he couldn't remember. Colt spent the night reading every document in his grandfather's papers, searching for something that could protect the women without bloodshed. As dawn broke, he found what he was looking for, a letter addressed to him in his grandfather's careful handwriting, along with a second set of legal documents the 3 men hadn't discovered. The letter explained everything. His grandfather had expected this exact situation, knowing that after his death the women would be vulnerable to extortion. But he had also prepared a solution that required someone he could trust completely, someone who shared his blood and his sense of honor. When the 3 men returned on the 3rd day, they found Colt waiting for them on the porch. He was alone, holding a leather portfolio, his face showing he had spent serious time making difficult decisions. "Well, son," the leader said as he got off his horse, "I hope you've convinced the ladies to see reason. We'd hate for this to get unpleasant." Colt opened the portfolio and pulled out official-looking documents. "I've been doing some reading," he said calmly. "Turns out my grandfather was even more careful about legal matters than you realized." The leader's confident expression faltered slightly as Colt held up a deed with territorial seals and witness signatures. "This ranch, Thunderhead Ranch, was deeded to me not through inheritance, but through a legal transfer that took place 5 years ago. My grandfather sold it to me for $1, with the understanding that I would take possession upon his death." "That's impossible," the younger man said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We checked all the territorial records." Colt smiled for the first time since arriving. "You checked the records in the territorial capital, but this transfer was recorded in the Federal Land Office, which takes precedence over territorial filings." He handed the deed to the leader, who examined it with growing concern. "Even if that's true," the leader said slowly, "it doesn't change what we know about these women. 6 dead husbands is still 6 dead husbands." "About that," Colt said, pulling out another document, "I've been corresponding with the Territorial Marshal's office. Seems there's been some new evidence discovered about that mine collapse. Evidence that suggests those 6 men weren't victims of an accident, but perpetrators of a robbery that went wrong." The leader's face went pale as Colt continued. "Turns out they had been stealing gold from the mine for months, weakening the support structures to cover their tracks. The marshal's office is very interested in recovering that stolen gold, and they're prepared to offer a substantial reward for information leading to its discovery. Beatrice appeared in the doorway behind Colt, her smile sharp as a blade. We'd be happy to show the marshal exactly where those men hid the gold they stole, in exchange for the reward money, of course. The three men exchanged nervous glances, realizing their leverage was gone. The women were no longer vulnerable widows, hiding a secret. They were potential witnesses in a federal investigation, protected by law, and entitled to compensation for their cooperation. "You can't prove any of this," the third man said desperately, but his words sounded hollow. Colt tucked the documents back into the portfolio. "I don't have to prove anything. I just have to file a report with the federal marshal and let him decide what's worth investigating. I'm sure he'll be very interested in talking to three men who seem to know an awful lot about events they claim to have had nothing to do with." The leader mounted his horse slowly, his face dark with frustrated anger. "This isn't over," he said, but the threat held no real weight. They had gambled on intimidating vulnerable women and found themselves facing federal law enforcement instead. "Yes, it is," Colt said quietly. "It's been over since the moment you decided to threaten people under my protection." As the three men rode away, defeated, Eleanor joined Colt on the porch. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said simply. "You found a way to protect us without becoming what they were." Colt looked out over the Thunderhead Ranch, now truly his, populated by 6 women who had chosen survival over submission and found the courage to build new lives from the ashes of their old ones. He understood now why his grandfather had chosen him for this responsibility, why childhood promises mattered more than legal documents. "He knew I would come back," Colt said, not a question, but a statement. "He knew you had the same sense of justice that he did," Eleanor replied. "The same understanding that some things are worth protecting no matter what the cost." The 6 women had found their protector, and Colt, the giant rancher, had found his purpose. The Thunderhead Ranch would continue to be a sanctuary for those who needed it, and the promises made by one generation would be honored by the next.